A German soldier crouches behind a collapsed wall somewhere outside Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942. It's November, minus 25 degrees. His MP40 is reliable enough, 32 rounds per magazine, and he's used it well. Then he hears a long, obscene ripping sound coming from around the corner. 25 bullets per second, give or take. He's never heard anything like it. That sound is the PPSH-41. And by the time that German soldier processes what he's hearing, the magazine is probably already empty. The thing fires at somewhere between 900 and 1250 rounds per minute, depending on who you ask and which example you're shooting. That gap exists because they weren't all built the same. The Soviets were making 6 million of these things. Some came out tighter, some came out looser, and the rate of fire reflected that. But even the slowest ones were genuinely unsettling to be on the wrong end of. This is the story of a gun that started as a desperate emergency measure and ended up changing how an entire army fought a war. And also the story of why German officers started picking them up off dead Soviet soldiers and carrying them instead of their own weapons. Which, if you think about it, is about the highest compliment one army can give another army's gun. The Soviet Union went into the Winter War against Finland in November 1939, expecting a quick, easy campaign. They had more men, more tanks, more artillery, more of basically everything. What they didn't have was a realistic plan for fighting in dense forests in brutal cold, against an army that had figured out how to use submachine guns properly. The Finns were running the Suomi KP-31, 71-round drum magazine, wooden rifle stock, fast and manageable. Finnish squads had one of these per team as a matter of doctrine, and in close-quarters forest fighting, it was devastating. Soviet soldiers were getting cut apart by sustained automatic fire from guys who knew the terrain, moved fast, and never seemed to run out of ammunition. The Soviet Union eventually won that war by March 1940, but they lost around 126,000 men doing it, and the lesson landed hard. Submachine guns weren't a niche weapon for special units. They were the future of infantry combat at close range. The Red Army's existing submachine gun, the PPD-40, designed by Vasily Degtyaryov, was fine but impossibly expensive to produce. Lots of milled parts, lots of machining time, 13.7 hours per unit, in a country that was about to be invaded by the largest land army in human history. That math didn't work. Enter Georgy Shpagin. Shpagin wasn't a household name then. He's barely one now outside of serious military history circles, but what he did in mid-1941 was quietly remarkable. He took the core idea of the PPD, stripped out everything that required precision machining, and rebuilt it from stamped sheet metal. The receiver, the barrel jacket, the magazine housing, all pressed and welded rather than cut and milled. The finished gun had 87 parts compared to 95 in the PPD. It took 7.3 hours to build. At peak production later in the war, they'd cut that down to 5.6. Here's the detail I love about this. To make barrels even faster, Soviet factories started cutting Mosin-Nagant rifle barrels in half. One rifle barrel gave you 2 PPSH barrels. The Mosin was longer than it needed to be anyway. This is wartime engineering at its most unsentimental. The PPSH-41 was formally adopted by the Red Army on December 21, 1940. Mass production started in the fall of 1941, a few hundred in November, then 155,000 over the next 5 months. By spring of 1942, Soviet factories were producing roughly 3,000 units per day. Read that again, 3,000 a day. For scale, Germany produced just over 1 million MP40 submachine guns across the entire war. The Soviets produced more than 6 million PPSH-41s. 6 to 1. That ratio matters more than almost any technical specification. Now let's talk about what it actually was. The PPSH fired the 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev cartridge. It's a bottlenecked round that looks a bit like someone took a .357 and put it on a diet. Fast muzzle velocity for a pistol cartridge, about 487 meters per second, and it punched through the early German steel helmets at ranges where the 9mm Parabellum in the MP40 was already struggling. Effective range of around 200 meters. Not a long-range weapon, not trying to be. The magazine came in two versions. The drum held 71 rounds, which is a lot. Honestly, it's so many rounds that it created its own problem, which we'll get to. The box magazine held 35 and was lighter, easier to load, more reliable. Most soldiers who actually had a choice preferred the box magazine, which makes the drum's iconic status a little ironic. The gun had a muzzle compensator built into the barrel jacket. It reduced muzzle climb during full auto fire, which is why, despite the blistering rate of fire, the PPSH is surprisingly controllable. Modern people who shoot it for the first time are usually caught off guard by this. The gun shouldn't feel as manageable as it does. The compensator also increased muzzle flash and noise substantially, which from the shooter's perspective is a minor inconvenience, and from the enemy's perspective is something much worse. Now the flaws, because there were real ones, and the Soviets knew it, and they talked about them internally, even if they didn't advertise them. The drum magazine was notorious. It held 71 rounds, but misfeeding typically started occurring around 65. You'd load it to capacity, and by the last 6 rounds you were playing Russian roulette with your own weapon, which is not a comfortable place to be in combat. The drums were also individually matched to specific guns during factory assembly. Each PPSH came with 2 drums, serial numbered to that rifle. Mix the wrong drum with the wrong gun, and you'd get feeding failures. Fine in peacetime, catastrophic when people are shooting at you. This was partially fixed in 1944 by increasing the metal thickness from 0.3mm to 1mm, which helped reliability but added more weight to a gun that was already not light. Loaded with the drum, the PPSH weighed about 5.45 kilograms, 12 pounds. For comparison, your average laptop bag with a laptop in it weighs about that. Now imagine carrying it at a run through rubble for 6 hours, then having it jam. The safety was also a genuine concern. The PPSH was an open bolt design. There was a sliding safety, but if you dropped the gun hard on a solid surface, there was a real chance it would fire. Soviet soldiers got hurt this way. It wasn't common, but it happened often enough to be documented. This wasn't unique to the PPSH. It was a characteristic of open-bolt submachine guns in general, but it still killed people who were on the same side as the gun. Despite all of that, the soldiers who carried it loved it, called it Papasha, Daddy, partly because the 3-letter acronym PPSH sounds vaguely like it in Russian, and partly because the name fit. Heavy, reliable, a little rough around the edges, but it showed up when you needed it. Chrome-lined barrel and chamber meant it was resistant to fouling and could operate in conditions of mud and extreme cold that would choke other weapons. On the Eastern Front in January, at -30 degrees, that wasn't a nice-to-have feature. It was everything. By the Battle of Stalingrad, Soviet commanders had started equipping not just squads or platoons with the PPSH, but entire companies, sometimes entire regiments. The tactical logic was simple. Urban warfare, which is what Stalingrad turned into from September 1942 onward, is decided at ranges of 10 to 50 meters. In rubble, in basements, in the wreckage of apartment blocks, you don't need a rifle that reaches 400 meters. You need something that puts an enormous amount of lead in a very small space very quickly. The PPSH did that better than anything else either side had in numbers. And here's the dark reason the Germans hated it. After Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, the Wehrmacht captured enormous quantities of Soviet weapons, including large numbers of PPSH-41s. Rather than destroying them or ignoring them, German soldiers started carrying them, using them, preferring them. The captured PPSH was designated the MP717R in German service, for the cases where soldiers just used them as is, with captured Soviet ammunition or 7.63 Mauser cartridges, which were dimensionally compatible. The Wehrmacht even printed and distributed German-language manuals explaining how to operate the captured weapon. Then they went further. A formal conversion program was established to rebarrel captured PPSHs to accept 9mm parabellum, the standard German submachine gun round. These were designated MP-41R, and they used modified magazine wells to accept German MP-40 magazines. More than 10,000 were converted this way. The PPSH became the second most used submachine gun in the Wehrmacht by some accounts, behind only the MP-40 that it was nominally replacing. Think about that for a moment. The German army, which had its own submachine gun infrastructure, its own trained armorers, its own supply chains, looked at the PPSH and decided it was worth the logistics headache of running captured Soviet guns in their own units. Captain Wilhelm Traub of the German army was photographed carrying one in Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942. He wasn't unique. The Germans had a specific reason to covet it beyond firepower. Their MP-40 had a 32-round magazine. The PPSH drum held 71. In a close-quarters urban engagement, the difference between 32 rounds and 71 rounds is the difference between winning and dying while reloading. German soldiers knew this. The Wehrmacht even developed a double magazine adapter for the MP-40 called the MP-40/2, specifically to address the capacity gap that the PPSH had exposed. The gun embarrassed a superpower into redesigning their own weapons. Over 55% of Soviet small arms by the end of the war were PPSH-41s. The Red Army had reorganized its entire infantry doctrine around this gun. Whole divisions of men carrying nothing but this weapon, moving into close-range engagements with firepower that German units simply couldn't match at that range. The math of 6 million versus 1 million eventually mattered on the battlefield in ways that were impossible to compensate for tactically. After the war, it kept going. North Korea produced their own version, the Type 49. China made the Type 50. Vietnam's Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army used it through the 1960s and into 1970. It showed up in Korea, Cuba during the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and in the hands of NVA soldiers who used it against American troops. A gun built in crisis by a relatively unknown designer, made of stamped sheet metal and cut-up rifle barrels, manufactured in 6 million copies by workers who'd never machined a weapon before in their lives. The Germans hated it because it worked. They hated it because it worked better than their own gun in the environment where it mattered. They hated it so much, they started carrying it themselves, which is a kind of hatred with a specific name. Georgy Shpagin never got nearly enough credit for what he did. He took a problem, equip a collapsing army with a weapon that can be built by anyone with a tin shop and a lathe, and he solved it. Not elegantly. The gun has too many rough edges for elegant, but completely, which is the only kind of solving that matters when an army is coming across your border. The Papasha, Daddy, a gun soldiers named with affection, enemies adopted out of necessity, and historians still argue about. 6 million of them.